Ah yes, the good old screw the poor mentality.
Hello everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of Business Blaze. This one is all about the Great Recession, which was like the Great Depression, except not as bad, but we all remember it. Just before we get started, I will say I've got a new podcast. It's called The Simon Whistler Show. And yes, I named it after myself. It's if you enjoy this kind of more free format style of me, you'll also like that podcast. It's less upbeat than this because it's a podcast, but I think you'll also enjoy it anyway. If you're new here and you're wondering what on earth is going on, I'm Simon. I read these scripts that Danny, our writer, puts together, and I make some jokes. They might be funny. They probably won't be. Let's crack on. On the 9th of October 2007, Wall Street was in a celebratory mood as the Dow Jones climbed to a record-breaking all-time high. If there happened to be any superstitious traders joining in the jolly celebrations on the trading floor, they may have just stopped and pondered to reflect how October the 9th is a bit of a dodgy date in stock market history. Just 5 years earlier, to the day in 2002, Wall Street had woken up to a massive hangover as the dot-com bubble finally burst. Yeah, I'm recording this the Monday after the Friday stock market. It dropped like 10%. I have a bunch of investments in like ETFs, like index funds, and the broker sent me an email. Hey, this is an automated email that we have to send out to you just to let you know that since you purchased this, it's dropped 10% in a day. Way! But it doesn't matter because I'm in it for the long term. Over the long term, it's always gonna work out. Don't sell, don't even look at it, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. This is why index funds are the best. Just 5 years earlier to the day, in 2002, Wall Street had woken up to a massive hangover as the dot-com bubble finally burst. I think we did a video about that. It's not going to be linked to below. If it is linked to below and I say, here's our video on the dot-com bubble, that's because someone had a go at me in the comments for being too lazy to link, and so what I've actually done is linked a video of Rick Astley singing I'm Never Gonna Let You Down. You're welcome. However, I'm pretty sure that Wall Street traders don't go in for all of that silly business of avoiding walking under ladders, never opening an umbrella indoors. I didn't even know that was one of these things. And refusing to turn over a cooked fish or change your bed sheets on a Friday. Are those things? I only know walking under ladders. You could be like, and breaking mirrors and all of that. I mean, it's all bullshit, let's just be clear. But I've never heard of like the last three. What if you shit your bed on Thursday night? I mean, then you're going to need to change your sheets on a Friday. Wall Street traders have other, more important things to worry about. It turns out that October the 9th was destined to go down in stock market history again, this time as the day that we witnessed the very top of the bull market that precipitated a huge global financial crisis. Another even bigger hangover was on the way, and it would be a very long time before anyone on Wall Street felt like celebrating again. Cry me a river! The Great Recession officially lasted from December 2007 to June 2009 and is now viewed as America's most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And just to be absolutely 100% clear there, because I don't want anyone misinterpreting that, I'm not making fun of people losing their homes and their jobs and all of that stuff. I'm making fun of like, I don't give a shit whether Wall Street celebrates. This did briefly get me thinking about how exactly these grand and dramatic names are chosen. And about the difference between a depression and a recession. Weirdly, there's no universally accepted answer, so it appears that economists just decide to go with however gloomy they appear to be feeling at the time. I thought it was to do with how long it was happening or how deep the recession was, whether it became a depression or not. But I guess not. That's why Danny writes these, and I just read it. Funnily enough, this whole Great Recession thing is actually kind of partly why I'm a YouTuber. I was just finishing university around this time, and all of those big law firms that were all like, yeah, we're gonna hire loads of people, they were quite affected by this. And so I didn't find it as easy to get a job at a good firm that I wanted to get. And by that I mean I didn't get a job. So I was like, oh, I'll take like a year off and I go do some traveling or something. And then I kind of continued doing that for a while. And then I was like, well, I don't know if I really want to be a lawyer anymore. So now I do this. Good news is it's probably more fun. God bless the Great Recession. A recession is usually defined by journalists as a period of 2 consecutive quarters of decline in GDP, whereas economists usually prefer to deal in monthly cycles of peaks and troughs. A depression doesn't actually have a standard definition at all, but it's often used to describe a long-term period of repeated falls in GDP, so it could be seen as a director's extended cut of a recession that gets dragged out far longer and with more severe consequences. Yeah, a friend of mine once tried me to get the director's
watch the director's extended cut of Lord of the Rings. Apparently, if you watch all of those movies back to back, it's like 15 hours or something. I didn't do that because I would rather shoot myself in the face. An old economist joke, I bet we're in for a treat, paints a more simplified picture of the differences between the two. When your neighbor loses their job, it's a recession, and when you lose your job, that's a depression. That is that even a joke? I also wonder what name we'd give to a second official depression if such a thing ever happened. The Second Great Depression. The Great Depression 2. The Great Depression rides again. I wonder what name we'd give to a second of it. Oh no, I said that already. It's stuff like this that keeps me awake at night, when it probably shouldn't. The main thing to take away from the recent Great Recession is that it was generally a bad time for everybody. Not as bad as they had it back in the 1930s. I should say that it would take a whole series of books to explain the multitude of elements that led to the Great Recession. I'm sure you don't want to watch a 6-hour video of Simon waffling away on about short-term investment horizons, off-balance risk sheets, credit default swaps, pro-cyclical regulation of loan loss revenues, and unforeseen rising prices of Mbongo. If you don't get that joke, thank you for being a Business Blaze regular, and you definitely don't want to see me talk about this because I don't think even people are always like, "Wow, Simon, you started a channel about business? That sounds boring as." Thank you for making it interesting. There are limits to my abilities. However, I'm pretty sure that we can effectively boil down the primary causes of the recession to about 6 words: subprime mortgages, risk, greed, and stupidity. I was actually doing an internship in the winter, must have been 2006, because it was the winter before all of this hit the fan. I was doing like a Christmas internship at a big law firm, and I spent an afternoon in what they call the securitization department, which I imagine we'll get into, which is basically where they repackage subprime loans for banks. And I was there was another intern, and there was like the junior lawyer who was talking us through the process, and they're like, yeah, so what we do is we get all this bad debt, we wrap it up with some, they weren't exactly saying it like this, but in a more technically complicated way. Then we wrap it up with all of this good debt, and we just call the whole thing good debt. And I'm like, wait, how does that work? That doesn't seem to make sense. They literally said, it's like magic. It wasn't like magic the next summer when all of this collapsed. It's all rooted in one of the central paths to the great American dream, owning your own home. Which I feel is more than an American dream. I dream of owning my own home. I own my own apartment. Yay! I mean, the bank owns my apartment, and I'm just allowed to live in it, assuming that I continue to make enough money to pay them. Getting your first step on the property ladder has always been one of life's toughest challenges and biggest achievements. It's naturally a little bit harder if you've got no money, no career prospects, and a terrible credit rating. You usually need a steady stream of income and a sizable deposit saved up in the bank before anyone would even begin to entertain the idea of lending you the money to buy your own home. In the years leading up to the crisis, the American housing market was booming, and the value of property was rising significantly year after year. This was helped along by incredibly low interest rates, which the US Federal Reserve had implemented to maintain economic stability. How'd that work out for you guys? The banks, financial institutions, and investors were in a healthy position to seize new and exciting ways to make even more money from potential new homeowners. It was during this prosperous period that we begin to see the massive growth of subprime mortgages. Now, even if you only know a little about the Great Recession, I'm betting you probably know it's got something to do with subprime mortgages. Effectively, this was a cunning strategy to sell houses to people who couldn't actually afford them. This so wasn't an American thing. The idea is that people who may have been refused mortgages at the standard prime interest rates could still get a subprime mortgage at a considerably higher interest rate. Ah yes, the good old screw the poor mentality. It's like, oh, you're rich, we'll give you a really low interest rate. Oh, you're extremely poor? Well, it's going to be more expensive for you, isn't it? Because that makes sense. I mean, from a business perspective, it absolutely does. But from like a let's not be a knob perspective, And don't go nuts in the comments. Anytime I say something like this, people are like, oh, Simon, you're such a socialist. And I'm like, no, I'm not saying that the poor people should have it better, even though maybe they should. I see that argument as well. I'm just saying that it should be the same for everyone. In fact, they'll often end up paying tens of thousands of dollars over the odds in the long term. It works on the solid business principle that people with lots of money should be able to get things as cheaply as possible, while people with no money should end up paying about 20 times as much. And that, look, as sad as this is, it is a solid business principle. This makes sense because obviously, richer people are a lower risk and poorer people are a higher risk when you're lending money. So it makes sense that it should be cheaper from a business perspective, but from a moral perspective, like I said, makes it seem like you're a bit of a knob. Still, the great news at the time for poor people was that they could now walk into a bank and quickly secure a $500,000 mortgage for a lovely new home without even having to pay a deposit, regardless of their income, bad credit history, or any remote likelihood of them being able to pay it back, which is insane. It may sound a bit silly, but yes it does, but the banks and financial institutions couldn't really lose either way, or so they assumed. If the new homeowner paid off the mortgage and ridiculously high interest in full, that would be great, the bank wins. The homeowner wins. I mean, sort of. They're getting a little bit destroyed on the interest rate, but at least they live in a mansion that they can't afford furniture for. If not, the bank could just foreclose on the house and then put it on the market again for even more money because the property prices would have risen even further by then. Yeah, I mean, assuming that the price of property continues to rise, which, was a good trend, everything would be fine as long as interest rates didn't start climbing too high and housing prices didn't fall. I mean, that could potentially really cock things up quite a bit. How could that ever happen? Hold that thought, says Danny. This new outburst of aggressive lending stretched out way beyond just the banks. The investment industry was more than happy to jump into the flames too. The banks would typically bundle up lots of these subprime mortgages into bumper packages called mortgage-backed securities and sell them at a discount price to investors. Yeah, and they all were rated like AAA even though they weren't. And that's exactly what I was talking about in that securitization department. This is what they were doing. And it just seems like, does no one get this? At this point, the bank effectively just became a middleman. They've thrashed out the mortgage deal with the home buyer and then sold the whole thing onto investors, recording these as big juicy profits on their own balance sheets. The investor now becomes the lender, because they own the mortgage stuff technically, and receives periodic payments from the mortgage-backed security in much the same way as they would do with a bond. Except in the case of buying a bond, assuming you're not buying them from Venezuela, they're going to be backed by if you're buying an American or a US Treasury bond or whatever, or bill, what do you call them in America? It's going to have that 2% interest rate or whatever, and that's only not going to be paid back unless the American economy completely and government completely fails, which is unlikely. However, this, not so. It's all good as long as those regular mortgage payments keep flowing in, which, can absolutely happen because they're lending $500,000 to average Joe. I mean, investors were hardly likely to part with their money unless a mortgage-backed security had received a reassuringly strong grade from the top credit rating agencies. And the good news is that most of these mortgage-backed securities received AAA ratings, indicating that they were pretty much the safest investments that you could possibly buy. Just to hammer this point home, the most reputable credit rating agencies in the world were strongly recommending investors to plow their money into buying up packages of subprime mortgages which were owed by the type of people who were most unlikely to pay them back. So the investment industry had nothing to worry about on that front, at least. Except they totally did. Hold that thought as well. So it was around this time that the housing bubble inevitably burst and interest rates started to climb again as housing prices took a dramatic plunge. Yeah, that thing they were like, this is all gonna be fine. It's going to be absolutely fine as long as housing prices continue to rise forever and interest rates stay low. Because those things never happen. Although in the UK, I swear house prices have risen for the entire of my lifetime, possibly the entirety of my parents' lifetime. Now houses are insanely expensive and people can't really easily get onto the housing ladder. Surely that can't continue forever. Someone will be watching this video in 2040 and be like, seems like Simon was wrong, I just sold my first house for £1 billion. This was bad news for homeowners who suddenly found themselves underwater. That's not to say they experienced economy-based flooding in their new homes. But rather that they were sinking fast into a situation where they were now locked into a bad deal. Yeah, because their interest rates have gone up and they can't afford them, so they're going to get evicted from their homes. It's a bad time. I feel like I've said this 1,000,000 times in this video. How could we have ever predicted this? It's like the economy now. It's like it's doing great. At some point it's going to go down. Maybe it's this year, maybe it's next year, maybe it's in 5 years. It's gonna go down. And then it will go up again. And everything will be fine. In many fixed rate cases, the value of the house was now considerably less than the mortgage they had to pay. So there was no longer an option of selling the house to escape the deal. Oh yeah, that's the double whammy. If you buy your house for $500,000, you could be like, oh, I can't afford it anymore. At least I can sell it and go get a smaller house, except you can't because you can only sell it for $300,000, $400,000. So you're $100,000 in debt, and you make like $30,000, $40,000 a year. You've been given this crazy mortgage. It's a bad time. In other adjustable rate cases, the regular mortgage payments had now increased to a much higher level than the initial payments, making it utterly impossible for home buyers to continue with the deal, even in the immediate short term. So yeah, fixed rate people who got a fixed rate mortgage, they were screwed. Adjustable rate people, they were just double screwed. Approximately 4 million people a year lost their home to foreclosure during the Great Recession. That's actually insane. Isn't the US population like 300 million? So you're talking like 1.5% of people losing their homes every year? The thing is, this also became very bad news for the banks too. Foreclosure was no longer just the casual side effect of some poor family losing their home. The thing is, this also became very bad news for the banks too. Yeah, no shit. Like, we all know the big names that failed. The sharp drop in house prices meant that the banks were losing stacks of money because the new value of the reclaimed house was now far less than the original amount they were expecting to receive. And it was bad news for investors too. Of course it was, as the value of their mortgage-backed security investments had plummeted. Yeah, because the credit agencies were like, these are amazing, when they're actually shite. In effect, both the banks and the big investment firms were dipping underwater in exactly the same way as the home buyers, because their assets in the form of property and mortgage-backed securities were falling well below the value of the money that they had been borrowing to pay for all of the crazy expensive shit in the first place. So they had become equally trapped by terrible deals and were sinking faster into debt that was impossible to pay back. Bear Stearns was the first major investment firm to collapse from the weight of mortgage-backed securities gone bad in 2008, with many of the managers facing criminal charges for misleading investors about the risks involved in subprime loans, although they were all ultimately cleared. Just 1 year earlier, the stock market had valued the company at $172 per share, but it was eventually swallowed up by JP Morgan Chase for a paltry $2 a share. I've really thought about getting cool set decorations for like this set for Business Blaze. It would be like, I'd love like an Enron logo, or like an Enron mug, but like official Enron mug, or like a Bear Stearns sign. I think that'd be cool. Let me know if you think that would be cool and where I can buy these. I guess eBay? Is this shit expensive? Because I imagine people would like this because it's kind of cool. But also maybe they don't, because it just reminds them of terrible economic times. If I was like, a friend of mine got made redundant when Lehman Brothers collapsed. If I was like walking out that office, I'd just be like, yeah, I'm gonna take that big Lehman Brothers sign, thanks. However, the biggest casualty followed later in the year with the bankruptcy of America's fourth biggest investment bank, Lehman Brothers. Still regarded as the largest ever bankruptcy in history, this company was apparently too big to fail, but it went ahead and failed anyway after amassing no less than $619 billion worth of debt. So yeah, my friend, if he stole that Lehman Brothers sign, he'd probably get a letter from a debt collecting agency. Yeah, we want to sell that Lehman Brothers sign that you stole on eBay to pay back $619 billion worth of debt. Just for some perspective here of how big a number 619 billion is, GDP by country, the biggest 21 economies in the world have a GDP bigger than that. So you got Switzerland at 20, Argentina at 21. The debt that Lehman Brothers had is bigger than the GDP of Sweden, Poland, Belgium, Thailand, Iran, Austria, Norway, UAE, Nigeria, Israel. It goes on to every other country in the world other than the top 22. So yes, it's a lot of money. Of course, the consequences of all of this created ripples that surged well beyond the banks and the financial institutions who arguably had been the architects of their own downfall. In America alone, 2.5 million businesses fell victim to the recession and more than 8 million jobs were lost. This disastrous domino effect also caused catastrophic ripples across Europe and most of the rest of the developed world. Yes, including Simon not getting a job after university and becoming a YouTuber. Although America officially came out of the Great Recession in June of 2009, the aftermath would continue to be felt for many, many years to follow. The move to recovery was helped along by the Federal Reserve's emergency loan of over $7 trillion. Let's just go back to our list. So that loan of $7 trillion is bigger than the GDP of every country except for the United States and China. And just for some clarity, if you don't know what GDP is, that's the entire value of like the gross domestic product, all the money made in that country in a single year. So this $7 trillion was lent to the banks to save them from collapsing, and a series of economic and stimulus packages which included the government pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into saving the likes of General Motors and Chrysalis? I imagine there's got to be an autocorrect error from Chrysler, right? Could all of this have been avoided? It's quite bizarre that nobody involved in the chain seemed prepared to just stop for a second and ponder the possibility of a bad outcome. I don't want to have a go at the people who are struggling to buy a new home, and we should all applaud any effort to help those on a low income get onto the property ladder, but these predatory sky-high subprime deals which locked homebuyers into a deal they couldn't afford or escape from was not the solution. Yeah, and I don't know how it was back in the day, because I wasn't looking at buying a house in 2007, because I was 20 years old in 2007. I bet they were marketing it like, yeah, we're helping the poor get on the housing market and buy massive homes that they can't afford for extremely expensive interest rates. Come in and check out our loans. I wouldn't mind owning a 200 bedrooms castle in the Scottish Highlands, but I'm not going to commit to a mortgage with terrible terms on this pipe dream because I suspect it would end very badly for me. Probably would, Danny. The banks and investment firms seem to be riding a wave of uber confidence and invincibility, when perhaps they should have paused to consider how realistic future changes to investment rates and the housing market could easily send everything into freefall. This alarming confidence and arrogance was only spurred on by the credit rating agencies who were slapping misleading top grades on packages of mortgages owed by people who simply couldn't afford to pay them. And of course, there's the small matter of these institutions being allowed to do this in the first place. In the aftermath of the recession, tighter regulations were introduced by the US government, most notably the Dodd-Frank Act, which gave the government more control over financial institutions and provided stronger consumer protection from predatory lending. Excellent. That's good to hear. There's that brilliant movie, it's not Margin Call, it's a similar movie, The Big Short, where at the end he's like, yeah, and then we introduced all of these regulations and everything ended up perfectly. And then he's just like, except none of that happened because these measures were just not nearly strong enough. Brilliant movie, by the way, The Big Short. However, this could be seen as closing the bank door after the bankers had already bolted. And it seems quite ironic that many of the people and institutions involved in drafting this new act were the very same people and institutions who had profited from predatory lending in the first place. Perhaps one of the most sickening things about this whole mess is that many of the most ruthless players who were helping to drive the economy straight off of a cliff were the ones who got away with it. When the profits of these major investment firms were going up, this naturally led to bigger bonuses for the managers who clearly didn't feel any personal risk from snapping up apparently lucrative mortgage packages and forging ever bigger bonuses for themselves. Yeah, this is the thing. Because like in the good times, you just get tons of bonus money. In the bad times, it's not like, oh, well, your performance was really like negative, so we're gonna need some of that money back. That just doesn't happen. You just get fired, if that. And then you get a massive severance package because, yeah, there's no conflict of interest there. This didn't particularly, there is. I was being sarcastic. This is a massive problem. They didn't particularly care if a home buyer lost their home. It could be argued they didn't particularly care when the company went bankrupt. Fair enough, it's not an ideal start to the working week, but it's not like they were ever under threat of becoming homeless. Their personal bank accounts were still heaving under the weight of all of those juicy bonuses which nobody was ever going to try and claim back. Instead, it was the everyday American taxpayer that got lumbered with a big chunk of the costs involved in salvaging the mess that these managers had created. Yeah, this wasn't just the US, the UK as well also bailed out a ton of banks. I think I just watched a video just before it went out on RBS. I got a friend who worked at RBS and it was massively bailed out by the taxpayer. We constantly made fun of him that he worked for us. Still, at least it wasn't as bad as the 1930s, and we're yet to see a sequel to the Great Depression. But if Wall Street ever appears to be celebrating good fortune on a forthcoming October the 9th, then it might be time to start getting a bit twitchy. Oh yeah, because all the bad shit happened on October the 9th previously, or twice previously. This should at least give us plenty of time to think of a good name. So far I've come up with Great Depression 2, Judgment Day, Great Depression with a Vengeance, for a few dollars less. I still don't know what you did last century. The Great Depression goes bananas. And hold that thought, guys, because this has been Business Plays. I've been Simon. This was written by Danny. If you've watched to the end of this video about economic depressions and recessions, you're an absolute legend because I'm not sure how interesting this was. I find it interesting because I find economics quite interesting, but if this was boring for the average person who watches this channel, I'm terribly sorry. And if you did hold that thought with Danny's suggested titles, here you go. Ba-da-boom-boom! See you next time.